Welcome to part 7 of this Sylenth Masterclass video tutorial, where we will be looking at and discussing the miscellaneous modulation options inside of Sylenth. So these pair and play very nicely with the LFOs and the modulation envelopes, and you'll see some similarities in the destinations and parameters, but there's also going to be some brand new destinations that you can modulate that we haven't seen yet inside of Sylenth. So you get 4 miscellaneous modulation destinations. And you see how there's 1 source box, 2 source, 3 source, 4 source. That's what you need to load up what you're going to be using to change the sound. So if I select mod wheel, for instance, this is the mod wheel. Almost every MIDI keyboard is going to have a mod wheel. Now I can go in these boxes under it, and I can select any of these parameters that we've seen in both the LFO and the modulation envelopes to be applied to my mod wheel. So just to cover, so you can understand what's going on, if I have this sound, which is what we've been going through a couple of the tutorials, and right now I have my cutoff AB tied to my mod wheel for the source. So as I turn this mod wheel up, you're going to hear the cutoff frequency open. They pair very nicely with the modulation envelopes, and when I'm doing sound design, the process is usually make the sound with the waveforms, go down the modulation envelopes, and strengthen the sound. Make it have more control over the cutoff, make it have some pitch to kind of cut through on the decay, those sort of things that we covered in video 5. And then in LFO 1 and 2, that's where I'll do some things to maybe add some distortion subtly, or to add vibrato, because Sylenth doesn't have an embedded vibrato control. So those are kind of thickening up the sound and getting them more mix ready. These miscellaneous modulation options, I look at them as a way to basically make your sound more playable and expressive. Because when you're playing a synth, it's not like sitting down at a grand piano and playing. It's a little bit different. This is how you can start to introduce some variances and differences as you're playing different values on notes, or different velocities, different lengths, things like that. So right now, I'm just going to cover what all these different options are. You have the mod wheel, first is velocity, which is tied to how hard or how soft you're playing different notes. So in Logic, that red note right there is the hardest that it can be played, the velocity-wise. It's at 127. And then orange is a little less. Then you have these green notes, which will be, let me pull up my velocity tool. So that's about 89, that's 100. So I went through and I changed some of these velocities in this progression so I could show you what that does, and we'll get to that in a second after we run through these. Next is the mod wheel, which we just demonstrated. It assigns any of these parameters to the mod wheel that you can then use to change in real time. Next is this key track, and key tracking is, we discussed that in, I think it was the filters video, where we have this key tracking knob, and you can basically apply key tracking now by using that as your source to any of these parameters like volume, pitch, cutoff, phase, etc. And then you have this amp envelope A. So this is going to affect this amp envelope A up here. So if you have a sound that uses both part A and B, and you're using the same amp envelopes, you'd probably set 1 with amp envelope A, and then go down to another source and select amp envelope B. But what it's doing is it's allowing you to control your amp envelope almost like you would a modulation envelope, which is kind of cool, because then you have 4 modulation envelopes. So because now you can, with this attack, decay, sustain, release, now you can select any of these parameters here, just like you can with the modulation envelope. You can select any of these parameters, and you have the attack, the decay, the sustain, the release. So it's another option just to further shape your sound and add more of a level of professionalism to it. Now you have this modulation envelope 1, which then allows you to control which is kind of fun. You can get some cool results from it. You can now control your modulation envelope with, say, your LFO 1 rate. So basically you're modulating things 3 times over, which can create some really weird results, or sometimes it can create some really useful results. Now you have LFO, which is a good source to use. So now I can add more cutoff just to my LFO. With this specific sound, I wouldn't want to do that because I'm using this LFO here for a vibrato effect. But if I was doing like a dubstep wobble, I could see myself using the LFO as a source and then applying the cutoff filter or the resonance or something just to change it. And then this next one you have is aftertouch. So aftertouch is something that not all keyboards are equipped with. So it's essentially a keyboard expression term for basically it's the amount of force applied on the key will then determine another feature. So what I mean by that is not all MIDI keyboards have aftertouch. Most do now. Not all programs do, but most DAWs do, like Logic does. And so if I assign the cutoff to A and B, the harder I push because it's feeling the velocity if I'm pushing when I let up, it's going to let through some more of that cutoff as I have now right here, aftertouch and cutoff, basically as you're kind of releasing the key. So it goes hand in hand with velocity, but it's kind of happening after velocity because velocity is the beginning of the stage. Aftertouch would kind of happen at the end of it. So the next thing you have is a step velocity, and this one's an interesting one. When I first got Sylenth, I could not figure out what it was doing until I was messing around with the arpeggiator. So if you hear what it sounds like right now, it kind of makes like a gate effect no matter what you stick it on. So we'll do resonance now. What it's tied to is it's tied to the arpeggiator, even if it's not on. It's tied to these velocity steps here. So it's a cool thing that you can use to kind of do some tremolo effects, some gate effects, things like that, without having to actually use the arpeggiator with your sound. So that actually might be cool with this sound, with the other, the chords layered under it. So now let's run through how you can kind of use some of these to shape your sound to make it more expressive and playable. First thing that I would typically do is activate the mod wheel, and I'm going to put the cutoff on it, just so if I want certain notes to have more of a cutoff frequency or less, I can do so. I like that. So now I'm going to go down to, I can add another layer to this mod wheel. I'm going to do phase, just do phase A, and I'm going to boost this up to about 8. So these are just doing things that make the sound more expressive. So now I can go down to, let's go down to velocity. Let's check velocity for our second source in the miscellaneous 1 option. And I am going to select, let's select volume A. So this will affect the oscillators for volume A. So now when I hit, if I bring up my MIDI editor again, so I'm going to hit some of these notes on my keyboard right now. See how there's more of, part B has this square wave, pulse wave, and this noise going, and A is using a saw and another pulse. So if I change this to, let's change this to both saw and saw. So this is soloed part A, and part B soloed. I'll bring that pulse back into it. So what this is doing now is when these harder velocities come in, it's going to play more of the sound from part A, which, so now that I just changed it, it's going to have more of a saw type feel, but it's going to be a subtle effect, but it's things that can really help make a mix come to life. All right, let's see what else we can do for this specific sound. I can let's select the modulation envelope 1, and then in this, let's select mix. Actually, let's do phase A and B for this. So now the phase for both part A and B are going to be controlling or boosting with this modulation envelope that we created. So you can hear the effect on the sound. It's pretty drastic, actually. So now I just added some, to my modulation, my second modulation envelope, I added some distortion to that pitch sound. So if you turn it down to the left, it'll make it clickier, and that's another trick I do to make pluck stand out in a mix. So that pretty much would sum up what I would typically do to this sound. I might actually change one of these to an aftertouch, and I could boost the distortion on the aftertouch. So I'm going to turn these off now as it's playing, so you'll hear the difference. It's just a much duller sound. See, these are really what you can use to kind of really shape the sound and make it way more expressive and more fun to play. I already had this MIDI progression played out. Now it's going to be more interesting to play because I have mod wheel assigned. Let's do, what do we do for this? Let's do modulation envelope 1 for that. I think I did modulation envelope 1 for this and modulation envelope 2 for this. Let's do mod wheel. We'll do velocity for this. Do velocity. And so now it's going to be more fun to actually just play on a keyboard. So I was hitting the keys with different velocities and things like that and holding them out for longer or shorter, and you kind of got those variances. So those are all ways to make the synth more expressive and actually just more like an instrument. So to recap, these last 3 videos, the modulation envelopes, the LFOs, and the miscellaneous modulation destinations. The modulation envelopes, they can help make your sound a little bit more polished. The LFO, they can make your sound have an element, a 3-dimensional element to kind of make it more mix ready. And the miscellaneous modulation options are kind of what you use to make it more expressive and make Sylenth play more like an instrument. So in the next video, we're going to be discussing the effects module, and it's going to be a 2-parter because the arpeggiation is going to be a lot of discussion, because there are a lot of options in it. And then that will round out this Sylenth Masterclass video tutorial. So I'll see you in the next video.